Rhino poaching in South Africa decreased by 23% in 2019. Environment Minister Barbara Creecy attributes this to steps being taken to address wildlife crimes. These are aligned to the integrated strategic management of rhinos, as well as principles set out in the draft National Integrated Strategy to Combat Wildlife Trafficking. To tell us more about this is the Minister. A very good evening to you, Minister, and thank you so much for joining us.
Good evening.
So, a person who's not really interested in wildlife, its population and measures to protect it would ask, why is this important to me?
Well, I think for two reasons. The first, obviously, is that what we call the biodiversity economy, or the economy that centers around our wildlife, our national parks and so on, creates 400,000 jobs in this country, which is equivalent to the number of jobs in the mining sector. So obviously it's an important economic sector. If you don't have wildlife, people don't come to see it. But the other important issue is that we have done a lot of work over the last couple of years to try and make sure that those who live in communities surrounding our national parks are increasingly involved in the economic benefits. And what we know about wildlife trafficking is that it is a highly syndicated form of crime, whether it's wild animals, rhino trophies, abalone, guns, drugs, doesn't matter to the syndicate. The commodity doesn't matter. What matters is the highly organized nature of the crime. And what often happens is that young people in those communities surrounding the parks fall easy victim to these syndicates, and it puts them on a very unpleasant lifelong involvement in organized crime that in many instances can even be life-threatening.
And as you say, it's quite a complex issue, the matrix, all of it, and but what you said really points to the fact that we and the wildlife are very much part of an important ecosystem. So it is important that the number of wildlife poached decreased. I mentioned the figure 23% in 2019, but do you have a multidisciplinary approach to it? Take us through that.
Well, I think that what has led to the steady decrease over the last 5 years in rhino poaching, and it's across all of our national parks, not just the Kruger Park, is, as you say, the multidisciplinary approach. So our rangers are working together with the police, they are working together with the military who are responsible for our border security. Many incursions in the syndicated crime come from across our borders. We also have very close links with the Department of Justice, so we're working on successful prosecutions and convictions. And of course there's also the international aspect of our work. We know that the destination for rhino horn is countries in the Far East. We have very good cooperation with a number of countries, including Vietnam, China, Japan, Malaysia, Singapore, all of whom are helping us to track down those involved in this form of crime and helping when they make search and seizure operations at their airports, then to contact us so that we can trace the source of the horns.
So I mentioned in the introduction the instrument that you're using, the NISCWT, and that's something that's going to come before Parliament, I understand, for approval. What exactly does the proposal achieve in us bettering the numbers of endangered wildlife?
Well, it talks about this integrated approach, and it really goes through all of the steps that would be involved. So it would look at the issue of detection. How do we find out that there are incursions in our parks? How do we catch people who are engaged in illicit activities? How do we make sure that they are successfully prosecuted? How do we make sure that they are convicted? How do we make sure that they remain in prison once convicted? And obviously, as I said, how do we then work across our borders to negotiate with surrounding countries and also countries in the international space so that we have a very tight net. And I think that it is the operationalization of this very integrated approach that really has seen the significant decline over the past 5 years.
And this cooperation regionally and nationally, how have you used it to better detect criminals who are obviously becoming as sophisticated as the science that you're using to prevent this?
Well, we work, for example, with the South African Police Services with their anti-gang units. Obviously, there's a link between rhino poaching and the illicit movement of firearms. In the case of abalone in the Western Cape, there would be a link to the drug trade. So that understanding that these illicit goods are part of a broader framework of syndicated crime is really what's helping all of us work together.
And why is that? Is it because the funds of one then help feed the other, just in terms of this criminal syndicate or network?
Well, I suppose syndicates don't care what they traffic, whether it's human beings, rhino horn, drugs, guns. They're not fussy. Those are commodities. And I think once you understand that, what you understand is that these syndicates can be involved in a variety of illicit activities. And if you pool all of the work that you're doing, then you get a better outcome.
So I want to talk about what you say is better situational awareness. So what does that refer to? Is it the cooperation that you mentioned earlier on, and how are you looking to improve it? As we just talked about, you always have to be a step ahead.
I mean, what you would understand is we have significant advances in technology that can allow us to survey our parks not only on foot but through electronic means. We obviously those advances in technology are helping us to deal with incursions. So in a place like Kruger, there would have been over 2,000 incursions last year, but there would only have been 300 and something instances where we lost animals. So what you can see is the proportion of incursions to losses is improving. And that's obviously as a result of improvements in technology.
So when you have lost animals, is it because of information collection challenges, or is it just simply because either you weren't aware of the population that you're dealing with, which areas that they migrate between, etc., etc.?
Well, I think that you can see if there's as many as 2,000 incursions in a year, that we're dealing with almost a war-like situation in the Kruger Park. And obviously some people do slip through the net. I think where we are often successful is in tracking people once crimes have been committed. So we have found people in possession of horns. We have also found people in possession of firearms. But I think what is also important is that we're not just catching the foot soldiers on the ground. We've had a number of significant arrests in what we're calling Category 3 and Category 4 crimes, and this would be people who are involved in transporting, storage, smuggling outside of the country. So while this may not be the kingpin sitting in some exotic location, it nevertheless does represent those who are making significant money out of this trade.
And this is, Minister, what I wanted to ask. You mentioned earlier on that these syndicates obviously target vulnerable people in these communities. So is your strategies in terms of recruiting rangers, improving their knowledge and appreciation of wildlife and its role in, as I mentioned earlier, on the ecosystem in general?
Look, we have a very big program called People and Parks, and what that program is all about is working with communities that surround our parks, educating children in schools about the significance of environmental protection, involving communities in ways in which they can benefit from the parks themselves, and obviously broader community outreach that would involve education and making the community aware where they can give information if they have information about crimes that they think can be committed.
Minister, thank you so much for joining us. Minister of Environmental Affairs, Barbara Creecy. Let's recap on the headlines, Aldrin.